All right, everybody. In theory, we are live, and we have a very special guest today. I always say that, but this time we actually do. Mr. Eric Helms is here, who will soon be a doctor because he's actually doing his PhD here in New Zealand. And at least finally, this time we don't have a time difference, so we could at least make it work just fine. So thanks so much, Eric, for taking the time.
My pleasure, and thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what kind of intro I would give to you, and I was just thinking that if I had some cousin or someone who would tell me that I just want to start lifting weights, and I don't, it's just so much information on the internet. Where should I go to? Then I would say that the five people in no particular order that had I guess the biggest influence on me in terms of getting good advice, it would be, I guess, Liam McDonald, Layne Norton, I guess Greg O'Gallagher that you just was in a call with recently, Menno Henselmans, and yourself. So it's a big moment for me. So with that said, actually, I know how you started out kind of as a typical kid, just trying to find a way to spend your frustrations and cope with your mental battles and stuff like that. And from there, you just arrived to the place that you are now, being one of the most respected natural bodybuilders in the world. So how does that feel for you?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't often get asked how does it feel to be where I'm at from where I started. And well, first I do want to say that I'm really just kind of like internet famous in like a very small circle. There's the fitness industry, and then there's bodybuilding, and then there's like natural bodybuilding, and it's very cool to be recognized and looked up to by your peers, and also at the same time pretty intimidating and scary to be seen as a leader and someone who provides information. Um, and yeah, I'm always a little bit in shock that I'm someone who is put on a list with like the people you just said. Because for example, when I was coming up, I remember having a similar list, and it was like, Lyle McDonald, Alan Aragon, James Krieger, and like Layne Norton and Dr. Joe Klemczewski. Some people might not know who that is. It was my list. Um, so it is really weird to hear myself on the same list when it was only like 2009, 2010, where I was someone who had lists, not someone who was on lists. So I think it's humbling. It's an honor, and it is definitely intimidating at times because sometimes it feels as though there's a lot of pressure. But I think a lot of the times I put that on myself. So it's just you kind of have to check in and kind of keep yourself sane. It's not exactly easy to be on display all the time, as much as I might come across as comfortable with it. So.
Yeah, right. Yeah, actually, it's interesting. I wasn't gonna go too long into this, but it's interesting that people who are really good at what they do are not necessarily good at teaching it to other people. So, uh, what would you say? Because you're a power lifter, bodybuilder, would you say you're actually better at doing or better at teaching these things to other people?
There was a time when I would have said that I'm a much better doer rather than teacher. But I had a few experiences that made me have to learn that skill very quickly. Um, so obviously, as a personal trainer, which I was for years, you get pretty good at teaching on a one-on-one sense, and teaching more the physical skills, and I guess it's more mentoring, Um, but I did work for about a year and a half at a place called Bryan College. I think it's now called Bryan University in Sacramento, which is where I was from before I moved to New Zealand. Um, and they had a 2 year, or rather an associate's degree program for personal trainers to get. An associate's degree in the States is basically kind of like half a bachelor's. I guess it's kind of like a undergrad diploma sort of thing. But anyway, so they had a degree program for personal trainers that I taught for, and they were in need of staff. So I got thrown into like, all right, Eric, you're going to go teach anatomy and physiology today. Are you going to teach these guys how to pass their exam? Just go. And I was at the tail end of finishing my bachelor's degree, so I was learned, but I was not comfortable with the information. And this was a time right around when the economy was starting to bounce back. So people had lost their jobs, but had enough money to go to school to try to get a different job in a market that wasn't destroyed, like,
Mm-hmm.
so I had a mixture of kids who, I call them kids because they were, just out of high school, who wanted to be a personal trainer, and also people who are in their 40s and 50s who are trying to retrain for a new field. And being in my late 20s, I didn't really relate very well to either group, so I had to figure out a way to teach what I knew to people with a very different background. And I think being forced to do that and be kind of thrown to the wolves, it made me become a good teacher. I started out pretty bad, but by the end, I was one of the more respected instructors and felt very confident in what I was doing. I think it really made me become skilled at what I do, because there's no better way to learn than teaching. Because if you can explain a complex topic in a way that someone who thinks very differently than you can get it, that's when you've really kind of looked at it from all angles. So I would say now I'm a very good teacher, but I was not always.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's you can definitely tell, or one definitely can definitely tell when listening to you in an interview that your thoughts are just so, like, you can tell that you've talked about this stuff for a long time, and it's kind of well practiced, and you know you know your stuff, and I guess that's what people need to see from a coach, after all. And so I want to say, just before I jump into the big questions that I want to ask you, first off, you talked a lot about volume and progressive overload and which one is more important. And so if you look at someone like Lane Norton or even yourself, you describe how, for example, in nutrition, there's a pyramid. Would you say that this hierarchy of importance is comparable when we talk about training and we talk about volume versus, say, progressive overload?
It's definitely murkier. Um, so I do have a pyramid that I created because I am part of the Illuminati. I do have a pyramid that I created for the muscle and for training. And the way I conceptualized that was that adherence is most important. After that, it is volume, intensity, and frequency. Then it is progression, which is not the same thing as progressive overload, but rather when I say progression, I'm talking about your approach or plan for progression. Um, Progressive overload is kind of almost a theme that encompasses everything. If you're adding volume, that in a way is progressive overload. If you think of it that way, it depends on what adaptation you're trying to get. That's the overload that you're progressing. And then after progression becomes exercise selection, and then finally we have rest periods and tempo. So the way I conceptualize that, I think it makes sense, but I could easily see an argument where you make exercise selection a lot lower, and you say, look, if I'm a power lifter, I'm an Olympic lifter, if I don't do the main lifts, I'm going to have a very poor chance of getting better at them. So therefore, they must be much more important. Or perhaps that if I have specific biomechanical needs or weaknesses in my physique, that exercise selection becomes very important. And if I don't use the right movements, then I could, run into issues with things like that. So you can more easily create a logical argument that would make my pyramid look wrong. Then I think the nutritional pyramid stands more clearly. Um, but in the way I describe the training pyramid, I think it makes sense. But of course, if the context has changed, then it changes. So the rationale for why I put volume, intensity, and frequency as a more important level of the pyramid than progression is because at a starting level, if you have appropriately established the right volume, intensity, and frequency, you will see progress. It will simply occur. And you don't need to start thinking about complex approaches to progression or progression schemes or advanced periodization models until you get to a certain point. So that was my rationale for that. But I wanted to emphasize that I didn't put progressive overload as a level. Rather, I put it as progression, because progressive overload is almost one of those like fundamental principles that needs to kind of be across the whole pyramid. Um, so yeah, it's a much more complex and dicier topic to make into a pyramid, which is why it took me till this year to do it when I made the nutrition one a few years back.
Yeah. The thing that I always wondered is, because you talked just that interview, Craig O'Gallagher, who, I mean, looks incredible, has a program which is like a 3-day split. And mainly the concept is, okay, just get as strong as you can on some big key movements while keep your body fat in check. There is another, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, called Mike Matthews, muscleforlife.com. He has a similar approach with a 5-day split. And while it makes sense to me that one will, obviously, if you put 100 pounds in your bench and you stay lean, you will look better, of course. But always kind of that little volume junkie in me is wondering, like, okay, how much volume could I add without getting stronger necessarily at all and get benefit from it,
Mm. You would probably get some, but if you add a whole bunch of volume and you don't get stronger at all, I would think there's probably something that doesn't make sense about the program in most cases, if you're starting from a low level of volume. And it's difficult to, when people talk about volume or intensity, I almost think they're creating a false paradigm, because if you add 100 pounds to your bench, right, and if you do 3 by 10, the volume load, sets times reps times load, is way higher now that you're benching more. So the point at which I think people need to start thinking about increasing volume, let's say they started with a minimalist approach as a beginner and just, I've got, a few sets and I'm just going to try to progress strength as long as possible. And not until do I stop progressing strength do I increase volume. The reality is the whole time they're increasing volume, but at a certain point they've gotten to a place where the small ticks up in load isn't enough of an increase in volume, because it is an increase in volume if you're doing, say, 3 by 5 with 100 versus 3 by 5 with 200. Going to 205 in that instance may not be enough of a new stimulus to see growth or progress on the bar at a rate which is measurable. So at that point, that's when you need to start thinking about, okay, maybe I do 4 by 5, or maybe I do 2 by 5 on that day and 2 by 5 on another day with the same movement. And I make, something like a 10 to 25% increase in my total number of sets or total volume load, depending on how you look at it. So they are, the reason I didn't have volume as its own pyramid level is because they're interdependent. If you increase the frequency while leaving sets and reps static, right, you've doubled your volume. Let's say if you're training once a week. If you just get stronger and you're making small increases in volume, if you add sets or reps, you're making increases in volume. So they're all, affect one another. So it's I'm not sure it's the right question to kind of go either I'm a volume guy or I'm an intensity guy. I'm either, Mike Mentz or I'm Arnold. I kind of think that there's a lot more shared between the two. They're both progressively overloading, but they're probably hanging out on the lower end of the effective volume spectrum or the higher end. And the question of what's optimal is, it's probably somewhere in the middle in most cases.
Yeah, it's interesting. The thing that I always wondered is many people like to bash on high volume, and they find that, okay, they've been doing giant sets, supersets, 2 hours in the gym every day, very high rep, low rest periods, all that kind of stuff. And then they switch to more reasonable volume, taper back the volume a lot, and focusing on the key movements, 4 to 10 rep range, etc. And then they see that they start to make consistent gains and their strength is starting shooting up, and they keep on doing it for years, many times on end. So in that case, what do you think they're experiencing there?
Well, if they're using a high volume approach like you described, where they're doing minimal rest periods, supersets, and giant sets, to me, I'm thinking like they're using 12 to 15 reps. They're resting short periods. They're doing like lateral raises. To me, it already sounds like an approach that's missing some issues that doesn't have anything to do with volume. It's that if you're training only high repetitions, that requires you to do more volume to be on equal footing with a more moderate or heavy load. For example, there was a study by Campos in 2002 where they had a matched volume of a group doing 20 to 28 repetition max, a group that did, I think it was 9 to 11 rep maxes, and then 3 to 5 rep maxes. And the 3 to 5 and the 9 to 11 had almost identical level of muscle growth, while the 20 to 28 didn't. And then in probably a more practical, like time-matched study. Schoenfeld recently compared 25 to 35 RM versus 8 to 12. And similar amount of time, however, the 25 to 35 RM, you can imagine, did, twice as many reps, or maybe 3 times as many reps, and about twice the volume load. But the growth was the same. So, and the downside is that these guys were like throwing up and stuff. So you have to go to failure if you're going to do really high reps. You have to keep, you don't have to, but if you keep your rest periods low, then you fatigue early. So it's almost kind of too much of a focus on fatigue and not enough focus on progressive overload and progressive tension overload. So if someone was going to say, oh, I went from a high volume program with the same intensity to a lower volume with the same intensity, then they might get just a temporary benefit of a taper, progress for a while, then they might plateau, unless they were just way overdoing it and then they came down to something more reasonable. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if somebody was doing some kind of silly Flex Magazine workout where they're doing giant sets with lateral raises and drop sets down from 70% of the 1 rep max to 50%. There's almost no component to them trying to get stronger. They're reducing their rest periods even more, so they have to use even lighter weights. It's very, very, very unbalanced towards metabolic fatigue and probably not enough focused on mechanical tension. So that wouldn't surprise me at all. But I don't think it would have to do with what happened. The volume went away. Why did they progress? I think it was they were doing some fundamentally suboptimal things in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. It's a fascinating topic, and it's just so interesting because in nutrition, I mean, I'm sure you see this as that the internet is essentially a big battlefield of essentially who can troll harder the other person with some opposing opinion. And in nutrition, the argument can go so far because you can present some pretty hard data, like I lost this many pounds in this many weeks. If you think calories don't matter, well, let's see who will get a six-pack quicker. It's a pretty quick thing, but muscle growth is just so slow that you can essentially troll however you want on the internet and present whatever ridiculous training plan that you want to. So it's kind of funny to see.
Yeah, so long as you find a way to create progressive overload, you will progress, and it does become a question of what's more optimal. And it's also about specificity. It depends on what you're trying to get to. Like there are divergent approaches that you see in Olympic lifting or powerlifting, but in the end, you've got everyone following a progressive plan using a few specific lifts and also doing accessories to some differing amount, and they're all lifting heavy. One might say, oh, you're lifting way heavier than me. Oh, you're Bulgarian. You're doing, daily 1 RM, and you're only doing 85%, but it's like, it's all like 80% plus work. It's definitely not light, No one's hitting double-digit reps in powerlifting very often, unless it's accessory movements or an AMRAP or something like that. So it's easier to see differences, and the chest press machine for 10 reps at way far from failure, and they saw a guy coming in doing a Bulgarian powerlifting routine and another guy doing a Russian, they'd both just be like, oh, they're both powerlifters. That's all it would be. Like, they're doing heavy squat, bench, and deadlifts, and they're really strong, But between them, they think they're totally different, but they're really not.
Yeah, right. I think one beautiful point that you made the other day is how you cannot determine how advanced someone is compared to how that person compares to other people. You have to look at the relative to what he could achieve, and that just brought to mind, it's kind of a totally random thought, but it just brought to mind that many times when people are talking about what kind of training method they should follow, or they're not really interested in what's producing the absolute most amount of muscle growth. They're really interested in getting those first, 30 pounds of muscle that you can put in your first few years of lifting as quickly as possible. That's really what they're interested in. So, yeah.
That's very true. And I almost, to me, it almost doesn't matter so long as you're doing it like reasonably intelligently. A novice, you're going to be a quote unquote intermediate anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, unless you're just doing something really ridiculous, And because I work with primarily competitive powerlifters and bodybuilders, I'm almost always dealing with someone who is past that novice stage, where you think about, loading the movement every single time you do it heavier instead of, doing an undulating thing or weekly progression even, which is more of kind of your intermediate. So yeah, I almost think I understand why it happens. I remember being a beginner and I was extremely motivated. I was very overzealous. I wanted to do everything super optimal, but I think I was just wasting my time most of the time because simply working hard and being in the gym consistently, just like everybody else, I got to the intermediate stage within 6 months. Progression slowed down. I put on my first 20 pounds in 6 months, and then it was a lot slower. And it was really no different than most other 6 foot skinny guys who are motivated and not doing something incredibly wrong. I was doing a lot of things that I've changed, but when I say wrong, some people are out there like, oh, if I don't train on muscle groups 2 to 3 times per week, I'm gonna not make any progress. Or if I don't do some low rep and some moderate rep and some high rep training, make no progress. Like, no, you can be suboptimal and still make 99% of your gains as a novice. I was doing to training to failure every time I went in there, training each muscle group once per week for a long time. And I make great gains. It's only when you're getting to that point where not everything works anymore and you're trying to push past the beginner stage where you really have to ask these questions that are most of the time being asked by beginners who it doesn't matter for on the internet. So yeah, it's ironic.
Yeah, speaking of wanting to do things optimally and being overzealous, and maybe this could be a good transition point into other topics, but I'm sure you're familiar with Martin Berkhan's work from Lean Gains, and he has a really cool article that went viral called the Marshmallow Test, and that's essentially about how in fitness and nutrition somehow it just seems to be a field where you're better off just getting the basics, just do a couple of bullet points. I have to do this and this, and then just forget about it and just go ahead and do other things with your life, because things will fall into place, and the more you think about this stuff, the harder it gets. So I don't know, to me, it's just, when I read that, it hit me that it's just so true. Like, overthinking this just destroys everything. Do you tend to see this with yourself even, or your clients, that overthinking nutrition?
Oh yeah, I mean, the only positive thing that came out of me overthinking nutrition and training is that now I I know what I know. But from a pure, just if I didn't want to become a researcher or basically a continuing education provider for coaches and all the things that I do, a teacher, that wouldn't have benefited me at all. If I just wanted to be the athlete, if I just wanted to be the best powerlifter or bodybuilder I could be, that was only harmful because it got me off track and onto random tracks for sometimes years of kind of following the wrong approach because I read myself into it without enough foundational knowledge, and this is something that I deal with on literally a daily basis with my own clients and with the times I guest lecture or when I was teaching more regularly, is that whole paralysis by analysis, or people just delving into the information overload. And because they haven't yet developed critical thinking or a foundation level of knowledge, it's all in the same playing field. So someone new to this might take an article by, a random, Muscle and Fitness or Flex magazine article, and then an article by, someone who's well respected in the evidence-based community, and they're the same, So it's just like, which 10 commandments do I follow? Should I be a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu? There's no way for them to develop a way of looking at it. So they just ask me like, do I need to be doing short rest periods or not? Because I don't know. So what I'm often doing with my clients is trying to teach them basic principles and very, very fundamental critical thinking skills so that they can get that kind of BS detector so that they aren't just lost in this abyss of information that's on the internet. And as an athlete, you're right. It is about consistency overall. I mean, consistency is like, if there was a horse race, consistency, if it's the name of this horse, it's out here and all the other principles are here, and this is proven time and time again when you simply see really good lifters and really good bodybuilders who are just older, and they're in their 30s, or 40s even. And yeah, and us knuckleheads in our 20s, and I'm speaking myself in the past tense, just worrying about all these details that we don't understand, and B, don't have as large of an impact as we make them out to be. And then getting into these ridiculous pissing matches online that just make enemies and don't make us any bigger.
Yeah, yeah. It, I don't. It's so many beautiful points that you brought up right there, and I don't even know which one I should go with. First of all, first of all, I watched like a Q&A kind of series with you, and someone asked you about the ultimate diet of Lyle McDonald, and you said like, well, sure, you can live that kind of lifestyle when all your life is revolving around, okay, keto, carb load, depletion workout, hit session, whatever. And the person you were talking to asked you like, okay, so do you think that only people who need that kind of craziness in their lives should follow that diet? And you said like, no, those people who need that kind of intensity should find balance in their lives. And you said that you're speaking from experience. So are you a bit of an addictive personality when it comes to nutrition and training?
Yeah, I mean, an easy way to answer that is I'm a competitive bodybuilder. I mean, there aren't wholly sane competitive bodybuilders out there. I mean, we're talking about people who have spent 9 months um, weighing and tracking food, and to be honest, it was actually more like 5 years. It was just 9 months. I was very precise, not eating out, um, hitting a specific target for protein, carbs, and fat every day, doing a certain amount of cardio every week, training as hard as I could despite the fact that I'm very hungry, increasing my cardio over time, decreasing my calories, practicing posing. And then eventually the payoff for all of that is for 2 10-minute periods for me to shave my body, put, this black muddy goop, and then flex on stage in a Speedo. So that is insane, and as much as it is, it's like I love it. I don't know why. It's just who I am. So I am definitely, like many of my stage flexing brethren, very naturally OCD. If I train myself, um, well, at least in the realm of bodybuilding, I'm probably a more relaxed person outside of that, but that's where it really kind of fosters. Have I trained myself to be a bigger picture thinker, to take a more balanced approach to life because it has allowed me to keep bodybuilding and be healthy and happy in life? Definitely. But I went through it in an unhealthier way first to understand that. So definitely I naturally am that way, for sure.
Yeah. It's interesting that and there's a couple of questions I want to ask you about this, because the reason why I loved your interview with Danny Lennon, sigmanutrition.com, everybody has to check that out because it will change your life if you're into nutrition and fitness. Because I remember you describing how a contest prep diet, you develop these behaviors of just being very, very meticulous with your tracking and measuring and everything. And it's just incredible to me because we know I'm sure you know that it's kind of shown that nutrition labels and stuff are like 20% off at times. It's not accurate, and if you're eating different foods every day, then you could be consistently off by a couple of hundred calories. So do you think that this very meticulous tracking and measuring is more about that kind of control mechanism, or that psychological?
100%, definitely. It is uncomfortable well, here's the thing. So people who are drawn, and I'm making some generalizations. Some people will be like, no, that's not me, but that's okay. People who are drawn to things like physique, sport, and even athletes in general, there is typically an element of a need for control. And if you look at people with eating disorders, often they're developed in a situation where that person, either as a young adult or when they're a child, did not have control. And one of the things that almost all of us can control is what we do with our food. Even if we aren't given the food we want, or if the food access is different than we might expect in a normal family, you can always say, I'm not going to eat it. Like that's you're taking your stand. That's a coping mechanism for many people who end up with an eating disorder. And not that an eating disorder is exactly the same as contest prep, but there are some parallels. And in many cases, bodybuilders are drawn to control, and measuring and tracking each variable, it feels good, and it makes them feel like they've ticked off all the boxes. Um, that doesn't go away. I don't think that that need fully goes away. It can be managed. It can be made more healthy, and with uh, a good awareness of what boxes are actually should be ticked off, you can shift the focuses to different things. Like instead of focusing on I've got to eat 8 meals a day, therefore I have to bring Tupperware with me, and therefore I can't hang out with my friends, and certain boxes create problems, right? But if I give someone a different set of boxes to tick that are based on physiology, and that it's relevant to what your goals are, and more accurate, fantastic, but also that allow you to have a healthy psychosocial relationship with the world, um, all of a sudden you can avoid some of those behaviors. But I'm still having them tick boxes because it's kind of like I'm using a different operating system that's more efficient and that's better for the machine, but it's still the same computer. If I'm using that analogy of our brains kind of having some programming that's very difficult to change, and it's not my role to change someone's programming. I'm not a psychologist. Um, but on the flip side of that, obviously, the to get consistent data, the more controls, the better. There's a reason why scientists are, in many ways, scientists do the same thing with a group that bodybuilders do with themselves. They control as many variables as possible to get an outcome, and then when something, doesn't go the way they are, they're able to isolate it. And that's what more experienced bodybuilders do, is they don't change everything all at the same time, and that's one of the reasons they're very meticulous outside of that. And then as a coach, it's kind of a blend of these two things. I'm safeguarding the needs of the athlete, psychologically, as you were bringing up. And then I'm also trying to control variables so I can figure out if something does or doesn't work, what's going on. So it is a balancing act. Like, definitely it's true. Like, not only are food labels inaccurate, but your energy expenditure varies so much day to day. So the macros that we might have put on a pedestal as these are the targets, you kind of have to realize, like, if my energy expenditure on a day-to-day basis changes by 500 calories, and why are these the macros? And so it's both me saying, right, I want you to hit these macros consistently, because then that's a consistent variable, but also realize, don't put them on too much of a pedestal. Here are some tools, to revert to just calories and protein rather than macros, or trade fats for carbs, or here's how you work in alcohol. I give them some tools, but I control that variable to whatever's reasonable, and then that allows me to make better decisions going down the line, while also giving them tools so that it's not detrimental. But at the same time, you can't just be completely loose with it all, because that doesn't give this person that sense of control that's there in the first place, and B, it doesn't allow you to really know exactly what's happening when things stop working. So there is an element where you do need to have that structure, but having the structure that makes sense rather than the one that is purely slaved to your psychology, is probably a healthier long-term approach, and can help the person retrain and think differently so that they can compete in a healthier and healthier way over time.
Yeah. And that, I remember, I mean, you mentioned this a couple of times, that your first season, you didn't have a plan of getting out of that kind of mentality, and you didn't have a big strategy set up, and you experienced some horrible weight gain after the competition. And you mentioned this a couple of times, and I was trying to find that story somewhere written down on the internet, but I just couldn't find it. So would you mind telling that story? Like, how did that happen?
It happens to most bodybuilders, I would say, their first season, or most stage physique competitors, right? Um, I had a very meticulous plan for how I was going to actually diet down for the show. To my credit, I did pretty good for a first season. I didn't have a great physique at the time. I'd only been training for 2-3 years. And I didn't get completely shredded, but I definitely showed up looking like I belonged on stage. And it took me from January to May. So I dieted January, February, March, April. I dieted 5 months, which at that time, 2007, when there wasn't the same kind of push for a more intelligent approach to it, that was considered a very long prep. Now it's kind of like when I hire someone, 5 months, I'm like, oh, you better be really lean to start. It's not very long, believe it or not. But anyway, so I had a plan to get there. My plan to get out was, well, I've always been fine with it. I'm naturally a skinny kid. I've never had, like, I don't even know how to get fat. Like, so whatever. My plan is going to be a list of restaurants, you know. Um, but I didn't have any way to know the extreme drive for overconsumption of food, and that swing back effect where you can actually overshoot your fat levels. Um, the amount of stress that I'd be under trying to diet down, a lot of it unneeded by the way I was approaching things. I was doing a lot of wacky stuff, like I wouldn't combine fats and carbs sometimes, and I had a food list of about maybe 8 foods that I would eat, and I was eating maybe 6 or 7 meals a day. Um, and all of that on top of a pretty hectic schedule and life in general. And I was a wreck by the time I got off stage, and it just turned into basically a recurring binge episodes. And I would try to then have low days to try to make up for the binge day. And eventually, I just gave into it. I was like, it's more stressful for me to try to manage the fact that I'm binging all the time. I'm just gonna eat until I'm not hungry anymore. Unfortunately, eating until I wasn't hungry anymore meant that 2 months later, I'd put on 48 pounds. And I looked up one day and I was like, I competed at 178 pounds and now I'm 226. Like, I couldn't believe it. I had never been 226 pounds in my life. The heaviest I think I'd ever been was maybe 205, 210. So I managed to put 15, 20 pounds on more than when I started my diet just 5 months prior. So in 2 months after the diet was over. So people had heard who I hadn't seen in a while, I'm meeting up with, friends from high school and they're like, oh, I heard you did a show 2 months ago. And they look at me like, did you really do a show 2 months ago? Like, because I looked like maybe a lineman in American football rather than someone who just did a show only in May and it was July. So it was bad.
Yeah, and chills are just going down my throat. Like, I mean, to be honest, I cannot really even laugh about this because the leanest I've ever been in my life was like 8% body fat, and it was below my set point, and I was hungrier than normal, nothing really pathological. But I remember that I had a bigger appetite, and some days I went way over, and I started going up, and my abs started to be less visible and stuff, and it was just to wake up after a day of kind of justified little binge eating, to wake up the next day and going through the stress and just looking soft and watery. I cannot imagine that, like, going from 5% of, I don't know, or even lower body fat percentage to up to, like, technically, I guess, overweight. How is the, like,
It was interesting. It's a slightly different psychology than, I run into a lot of people who for a large portion of their life before they even got interested in competitive bodybuilding have been very focused on looking lean, and they're always trying to stay lean, and they go through these kind of periods, and they look up and they contact me because maybe 4 years out of their 5 years of training, they've been in a cutting state or trying to maintain a very low body fat. That I see a lot. But other people who get into bodybuilding, they have been trying to gain weight for forever, and they don't necessarily have that background. So it's a huge surprise when they deal with that. And it's not necessarily losing my condition or putting on fat that really freaked me out, because I never really was concerned about my body image that much. I got into lifting weights um, from an odd kind of place. It wasn't necessarily like, I'm not happy with my body, I need to change it. It was more like, I'm not happy with my life, I need to do something. And I just fell in love with it. Um, so for me, it was much more the mental side of it. The fact that for the first time in my life, I couldn't control what I wanted to eat. I did not want to binge. I was clearly doing something I did not like, and I just felt completely out of control. And you can imagine, for someone who is drawn to control to do a bodybuilding show, the stress of feeling like you can't control something that you controlled for 5 months. Like, I would I weighed out my peanut butter to the gram, and now I can't only eat 2 slices of pizza. I have to eat the whole pizza. Like, that made me feel weak. That made me feel like I was a fraud bodybuilder. It made me feel like there was something wrong with me, like I had a eating disorder, and I probably technically did for a little while there. Um, so the emotional state was more related to, like, what the hell's wrong with me? I feel like I'm crazy, and just lack of control. And I think that was the big one. It really just felt like I didn't get to choose where my life was going, and that was not a comfortable feeling for me at all. One of the things that helped me get out of it was actually reading about the Minnesota semi-starvation study, and which is, for those who don't know, in the 40s, Ansel Keys did a study, a famous researcher, on how to get people who had starved. So, like, we're talking POW and even Holocaust survivors back to a healthy body weight. So, putting a bunch of men on half of the calories they needed to maintain weight for 6 months straight in a controlled condition. So, they were basically locked up, so they couldn't do it. It's not the kind of thing that would pass an ethics board today. But it's one of the pivotal pieces of research that has informed us about what happened to people's diet. And there was some wacky stuff that happened. Like, some people became professional chefs after the study was over. One guy apparently, I think, cut off his finger. I could be misquoting at a certain point in the study, and that's how he got out of it. There are people who broke out of the controlled conditions they were in and binged at like basically a commissary kind of thing. Um, Everyone was showing signs of, at the time, the way they diagnosed, because there's different diagnostic criteria for eating disorders. So everyone at the time could have been diagnosed for anorexia. I don't know if that's still the case based on the current diagnostic criteria, but it showed that some of the things that we see as a eating disorder aren't just the behavior, they're where you get to physiologically. And all of a sudden it started to make sense. I was like, yeah, I'm more focused on food than anything else in my life. Like, I'll be talking to my wife, and then I'm like, yeah, and I'm thinking, I have no idea what you just said because I'm thinking about lunch. I know it's coming up, you know. So the food focus and the lack of control really started to make sense when I read about this group of guys going through the exact same thing I did, a 6 month period, or almost 6 months in my case, of getting down to as lean as your body will let you get, and then, you know, seeing what happens, you know, and I saw the same thing they did, and I just happened to have the benefit of a modern society where I could look it up on Wikipedia and feel a little less crazy, which was actually extremely helpful. And I was able to get my proverbial shit together after that.
Yeah. Obviously, this made you a better coach. But do you think it changed your relationship to food and things like that?
Yes, and I would say it took me until maybe 3 years ago before I got back to what I would say would be a naturally healthy relationship with food. And I'll explain what I mean by kind of telling a story. So, uh, I started dieting for that show in January 2007. That's when I started tracking nutrients, weighing foods, tracking my macros for the first time. I didn't actually stop tracking my macros until 2012. So that
Mm.
was 5 years of weighing and tracking foods. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean that I didn't go out to eat with my wife or eat out at holidays or take days off tracking the food, um, or revert from macros to just calories, or maybe make a 48-hour window where I could hit it. But I was always tracking, and when I could, I would weigh it out. And in 2012, I kind of realized, I'm going to be moving to a new country. I'm not going to have access. And I had a discussion with my wife, and she was like, you're great about doing it in a way that doesn't affect me, but just the fact that you're doing it, to be honest, I don't think it's necessary, and it's kind of weird. And I went, it is kind of weird. That is, it's fine for me. I'm making it happen. But like, Berto, Jeff, Brad, my colleagues, they're like, we don't track macros to that degree in the off season. We keep it in check, but do you really think you need to weigh out your oats every morning? That kind of thing. Like, do you not know what a bowl of oats should look like? Um, so now I got to New Zealand. I was like, do I really need to do this? I've heard that the body actually has a way to regulate body weight. I heard it's called like hunger and satiety. Wouldn't it be nice if I could actually start to use those signals again? So for the last 3 years, I have just been eating as I want and just basically keeping mindful of the things that I habitually don't keep in place in the off season, which is under eating, because I get to a certain point and I just lose my hunger. Like right now, I'm maintaining about 201, 202, reasonably lean. But if I try to get any heavier than that, or even try to maintain that, I just kind of basically what will happen is I'll end up just cyclically accidentally cutting because I lose my hunger signals. So I have to ensure that I eat enough, and I have to ensure that I get enough protein in. So I track a few things. And to be honest, if you track for 5 years, you can't not know where your calories and macros are roughly. Like I can always tell you about where I'm at for the day, and sometimes I'll check it. And I'm always right. Like, for example, I'll give you two examples to show you what 5 years of macro tracking does to your ability to kind of see the zeros and ones in the matrix kind of thing. Um, a buddy of mine had a yam on his desk, and I said, "Hey, I think that's, or it's called a kumra here." I said, "I think that's 63 grams." And he was like, "What?" I was like, "I bet you that's about 63 grams." And he was like, "Shut up." He put it on the scale, and it was 62 grams. So, and then he
Yeah.
did it. I did it again just to show that it wasn't like a magic trick, like just a fake thing. It wasn't a fluke. Um, and then also another example would be I participated in a study for a 16-week diet tracking study. We used MyFitnessPal and tracked, and it started with a 4-week baseline period. And the researcher who I was working with was like, so like, we're just going to track your baseline calories, and you'll come in, and then we'll go from there. And I said, I think I'm probably taking in about 2,800 calories on average, and I bet I get about 2 grams per kg of protein. And he said, okay, well, we still got to track. And I said, okay, sure. So at the end of the 4 weeks, it comes back. Average calories are 2,741. My protein intake is 174, which is just barely under. I was at 90 kg, so I can't not know where I'm at, but I'm not chucking everything on the scale. I eat anywhere between 2 to 4 meals a day. I eat out as much as I want, so I'm actually using the skills I learned rather than let them being kind of like a crutch or training wheels that I just don't need anymore. And that is something that I actually could encourage my athletes to do in the off season, is get down to tracking the minimal amount of variables to be consistent rather than all of the variables, which is more appropriate just for contest prep.
Yeah, it's two quick points I want to make off of that. Is one of them is, I think if when we're talking about flexible dieting, I guess that's all cool and fine. But I think for a lot of people, the more you include these quote unquote junk foods, the more accurate you have to be with your measuring, because the less you can rely on your natural satiety signals, right?
That's a great point. I mean, the foods that we consider quote unquote junk, they are a component, not all of the obesity epidemic, because they increase satiety more than they blunt it by eating it. So people tend to overeat. And they're packed with calories. When you have a really, really high fat and high sugar item, the average person, even with some nutritional knowledge, will guess, and they'll be like, "Oh, yeah, it's probably 200." They're like, "No, that's a 600 calorie cookie," and you're like, "What?" So it makes you more likely to be off, and you can't trust your natural signals as much. So you're 100% right.
Yeah, yeah. It's when people talk about, or first of all, I think, do you think, because you're just saying that you're losing your appetite? Me, for example, I don't think that's possible for me. Like, you just need to put the right types of foods in front of me, and I will eat them, like, to the last bit. And like, the amount of food I can pack down is just incredible, especially compared to my size and what you would think. And do you think that, it's kind of a funny question, but do you think that the people who are best at cutting and just making weight very well and make it big essentially in bodybuilding, like yourself, are people who just don't like to eat that much in general?
Not necessarily. Definitely not necessarily. Like a great example of someone who's just shredded and can maintain shredded is Alberto Nunez. But
Hmm.
Alberto was a fat 250-pound guy at one point, and he forced himself to get there. And to do so, knowing that this guy's TDEE is so high, he was eating like 6,000, 7,000 calories a day for a long time. I mean, maintaining a fat, bloated 250-pound body when you're, 5'9" is not easy. Um, and I think if you just totally hated eating and didn't care, it, it, it wouldn't be that easy either. So you get people who are you get all types, and to be honest, because I've worked with people who were formerly obese as teenagers and people who have always been skinny. They have different psychologies or tendencies, because everyone's their unique person, but they have different tendencies that you will see and different struggles. But there are, like, if you look at the classical, like, very, very successful bodybuilders, you'll get from both backgrounds, man. It's just different problems and different hurdles that they have, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard that he was 250 pounds before, but I thought that was a joke or something. But then,
No, man. He had no taper. It was just kind of like fridge body. It was good. It was pretty funny.
wow, that's incredible. Because
Yeah.
for those who don't know, that guy is pretty much known for his vascularity that like it's almost superhuman. it's
Yeah.
it is
He,
crazy.
yeah, he's exactly. I mean, he competes at 5'9", 160 pounds, and some of the best conditioning that you'll see on a natural bodybuilding stage, or any bodybuilding stage for that matter. Conditioning is not really about whether you're natural or not. But anyway, so to look at him and go, wow, you were 90 pounds heavier, you know, and to think like not 90 pounds of muscle. I mean, it's,
Yeah, yeah,
like as much muscle as you can get from getting that fat. But, you wouldn't keep all that lean body mass dieting down, obviously, but I would say probably 60, 70 pounds more body fat, So,
yeah, yeah. That's amazing. Just before we start wrapping up, there was another topic because you just mentioned natural,
mm,
so that brought to mind that you know it's just interesting to me that there is kind of these two camps on the internet, and one of them is kind of like just filling up pages and pages of forum discussions about who is natty and who isn't. And there's another camp who is like, whenever that comes up, they're just like, why do you even care? Who gives
mm.
a shit? Like, why do you even care? So I don't know, where do you kind of stand on that?
I think the why do you even care camp is dominated by people who are so tired of the same stupid debates. Um, because they don't lead anywhere, and most of the time they're just examples of people's own personal biases. Like if people wanted this, like there was a point where it just got to this crazy ridiculous thing where people would um, just call out any natural bodybuilder, and then there was like, there are people who would post like, there's no such thing as natural bodybuilding, like it's all just guys who are on a little bit of gear, and to me, like why, like that's, yeah, I just don't understand, like the debate got so extreme. There was either your complete conspiracy theorists on one side, or the let's not talk about it at all, this is not an issue, you guys are just haters thing, and it's like, they're this is obviously ridiculous. The idea that basically just people are just drinking steroids out of the tap water, and anyone with a decent physique who picks for weight is probably on gear is kind of insane. But not want to talk about it all. It's primarily a reaction to that, and not a useful one, because I think where the problem that stems out of that is that people who are new to the game don't really understand what is a reasonable physique to try to attain, or they don't know what the truth is. When you have people who are completely uninvolved in natural bodybuilding, and are just looking at physiques and have really no idea, most of the time they're either very young and frustrated with their progress, or potentially there's someone who's been on gear for their whole life and doesn't have any really idea of what they could have done without steroids, who are making these comments like, of course, if this guy's as big as me and I've been on gear for 10 years, then he's got to be on gear. Well, it's like, dude, you started when you're 17. I mean, maybe you would have had a decent physique without it, or dude, you only are 17. How the hell would you know what someone could accomplish? And so it's the debate is not very useful in any way, and I don't think people show enough humility. Like if someone is borderline, you know, and you're not sure, and you just well, or you shouldn't be sure, but someone comes in there and says that person is definitely on gear, I'm going to destroy that person, I'm going to make a video, I'm going to call them out. Like, what if you're wrong? You just destroyed someone's reputation. That's like, the guy who's sitting in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Like, that's really not cool. Like, in my mind, it's like, if there is a possibility, if there is a hint of a doubt, like, maybe we should show some humility, because that could be very harmful to someone who might actually be natural. I've seen it many, 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 many times. People who I am 100% convinced that they're natural have been, drugged through the mud, and their reputation has been tarnished based on absolutely nothing factual except some loud person's opinion. And you can't really come back from that, because, like you hit it. Yeah, I heard that rumor that Alberto Nunez is 250 pounds. Like, that exists in all types of things you hear on the internet. Like, I heard that rumor that the X guy was not natural. Like, and it might have been completely just based on nothing, or even trolling. And now it's just the stigma the person has because there was some guy who was just convinced, or gal, or whatever. So I think it's a very frustrating debate because of the form it takes. But when it's intelligent, it can be quite interesting. Sorry, quite interesting. Like, Casey Butts has done a great job at looking at what is some of the natural muscle potential out there, and I'd like to think I did a nice contribution to that with
Yeah.
the article I did for the AARR for Alan Aragon, which is he made free. He thought it was important enough. So I think when it's intelligent, it's a very cool topic. So that's why it has so much interest, is because it's relevant to people to know what's reasonable to get to, and a lot of people don't want to use steroids, so the normal people on the cover of the magazines isn't relatable to them, and they also can feel very betrayed when they finally find out that, oh my God, everyone I've been looking up to is on gear. So there's high levels of emotion, high levels of interest, and it produces a very non-productive discussion. So it creates fighting. So it just kind of elevates into volcanoes, but none of it's useful. So I think when it is intelligent, it can be a very cool discussion, and I actually like it. It's just that now that people are willing to call anybody out, or just I guess it's not even people. You know, the internet makes it seem like the loudest voices seem like they're more people than they are. It's a small minority of very loud, opinionated people, and sometimes to me it feels like it, because I'm in the natural bodybuilding scene, that it's everyone's hating on us, and that's not even true. It's just a
Yeah.
loud minority.
Are you familiar with the site called nettyornot.com?
Yeah, that is a it's almost I don't even know if it's serious. It's so ridiculous, that
Yeah.
site.
I mean, that's just I mean, all that does is like, okay, let's take your stats compared to someone who we know use drugs, and if it's even close, then you're on gear, like no question.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
and then make up the stats half the time anyway, and then just make shit up. It's great. No, that website, I've actually always thought it's not real, that it's people just trolling. But if it
Yeah.
is, then
I
that's
mean,
kind of sad. So
it's
anyway,
unbelievable. Yeah, it's like, do you guys within the community, that's what I always wondered, like, do you know about each other, like do you discuss this between each other, that like, yeah bro, by the way, like, yeah, of course I'm telling that to the public, but yeah, I'm on gear, like does that happen at all?
I have, I mean, maybe in a different community than I'm in, but I mean, I come up in like everyone I know is just a bunch of guys who love lifting weights but aren't really comfortable with the idea of breaking the law or taking what they
Yeah, no,
often
I
perceive
I
as.
didn't mean you guys specifically, but just like in general in the
Yeah,
bodybuilding community.
right. You know, to be honest, I'm sure I guarantee you, like maybe you hear it, like if you go to like the Olympia, like people ask questions like, "Hey, are you natural?" Like 100%, and then everyone laughs like he, you know. Or there are some IFBB pros who will very much openly talk about their drug use, and other guys, like, you know, like if you heard interviews with Jay Cutler, he'll talk about, like, you know, obviously, you know, that bodybuilders have to do certain things, and he'll talk around it without ever admitting it, because
Mhm.
I guess he feels like he can't. But yeah, I mean, in the groups of guys who and gals who are openly using anabolic steroids, or it's very clear, and they're all doing it, you know, like at national level. I remember, I shouldn't say names, but I met a very high level NPC competitor trying to get his pro card at a supplement store, and he said, you know, I asked him a few questions, and he stopped me and he said, just to make sure we're on the same page. Like, I'm an advanced level bodybuilder. I take a lot of anabolic steroids, so just so you know that. And then he kept talking, and I was just like, oh,
Oh.
that's probably the most open I've heard it. Like, I knew that, I assumed, but he stated it just like, you know, just so you know, like, let's not get too caught up on like my opinion on creatine. I want you to know I'm on all the gear, you know, kind of thing. So
Yeah.
that is something that is definitely discussed in that community. And if you were to go on, you know, certain message boards and stuff like that, you can see it. But at the same time, in the United States and other countries where it's illegal, they're very guarded about it, because they could be, you know, prosecuted. But but yeah, like in the natural bodybuilding community, um, you'd be ostracized immediately. Like if someone came up and it was like, "Hey Eric, you know, I'm actually on gear," I'd be like, "Whoa, like that's why are you cheating?" You know, like I don't care if Ronnie Coleman's on gear. That's great. They have their level playing field. We try to have our level playing field. So it's yeah, there's not a, as much as some guys think there's not a little secret community of us all harboring this conspiracy that, man, just never come out, like all conspiracies. So
Yeah, and it's, people don't realize like how big of a deal it becomes after you reach a certain level of fame and reputation. I mean,
mm,
for example, you know, Lane Norton is well, he's discussed obviously a lot on different forums and whatever message boards and stuff. And I mean, for a guy of his reputation and for what he's done for the community and what a name he is, I mean, and the funny thing is, like, even like whatever is the case, like, he has done so much for the community. Like, his advice is good. We know he preaches the good word. But if it turned out about him, I mean, that would be like as big of a deal as Lance Armstrong. Like, it would destroy the community, like, in some ways, probably.
Definitely, no, it would be a big blow to the community. And I mean, and also think about it from his standpoint. I mean, this is a guy who, pursuing his PhD, now has it, an active scientist, living in the United States, competing in the IPF worlds and USAPL, being off-season drug tested, being tested in competition, competing in the IFPA, which is polygraph and urine tested. I mean, the lengths he would have to go to evade all that detection, he would invariably eventually get caught if he was on something. People say, Lance Armstrong didn't get, he didn't get caught. Like, yes, he did. That's how we know he's on gear. They had a blood sample from him from years back that they finally tested again, and he got caught.
Yeah.
People do eventually get caught. And knowing that, the amount of risk, I mean, you could get you could be banned from the scientific community, the academic community, never be able to compete as a powerlifter, never be able to compete as a bodybuilder, and lose your job. All the clients you train, all the articles you write. I mean, for him to do that, it would be the dumbest, most short-sighted risk ever. And it just wouldn't make any sense. Why would someone risk that? So I think people don't think of it sometimes from that side. Like, I can't even imagine knowing that I'm randomly tested. I could be randomly tested, as an IPF athlete in the off season. And I'm tested in competition. I'm polygraph tested. That failing any of those pretty much is a career ender, and potentially, depending on how much of my identity is wrapped up in me as a bodybuilder, a identity ender. I mean, that would be like, I'd be worried if someone in that level of stature cheated and got caught, about suicide. I really would. So to me, I just can't even see like why someone would do that. Now that's different than someone who doesn't compete in anything, isn't an academic, and just has a YouTube channel. They're never going to get caught. It's just what they say on a channel. Like, I'm natural, and then it gets some more clicks and views. Great, unless someone like sneaks into their room at night and like takes a blood sample and can prove it. Like, there's no risk, but there's a huge risk when you're doing that, like you said, to the community and to the person. So it just doesn't make any sense, like, why anyone would risk that. Even if you didn't think you were going to get caught, the fear of getting caught would be like just the most stressful thing in the world on a day-to-day basis.
Although I guess if you did it like years and years back, and like then you're kind of reap the benefits of it, and now you're natural, I guess you could get away with it. But yeah.
Well, you're not really getting away with it. Like, there's a time drug-free. Like, in natural bodybuilding, you need to be drug-free for, depending on the organization, 5 to 7 years. And there's many, many, many bodybuilders who have, went down a pathway and went, that's not for me. I want to be natural, and here they are. Like, it's very commonly well known that I used over-the-counter pro hormones in 2005, 2006, before I was even considering competing in bodybuilding. Found out what the deal was with natural bodybuilding, had to compete in certain organizations, stopped taking them, and then had to wait, years before I compete in the INBF and things like that. And I love the idea that there's that somehow the steroids you took years ago are giving you this massive benefit. And they'll cite these studies on like changes in satellite cells and things like that. But there's never been a study that's looked at how big people are who once took steroids but have been training for 15 years and then did. So it's a huge leap, to assume that what you're able to maintain with drugs is giving you a competitive advantage now. Is there a difference at the muscle cell level? Yeah. But does that mean that it actually translates into being able to lift heavier weights in competition or maintain, higher lean body mass than you would normally? You could speculate, but having seen many bodybuilders who used to be on something and now 7-10 years later they're not. they don't maintain the size. They may have gotten to their natural potential a little faster or something like that, and yeah, that could be seen as a competitive advantage. But
Yeah.
but in the end, I think that is, and it's not like people plan to do that. Like, I'm going to use gear from 2002 to 2005, and then I'm going to wait till 2012 to compete. That's kind of, I don't think people think like that. So.
Yeah. Well, Ted, thanks for that input. It was, I think that's many good lessons for people to take away. Like, even just when they decide to go on a forum and start a battle royale, whatever, over who is natty and who isn't. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think we've just talked about over an hour, and I want to thank you so much for coming here. For the very end, I would like to plug you as hard as you can. That sounded a bit weird. So please.
And it's just our first date. I love
it. So please tell us about that new book that you're working on, and where people will be able to find it and what it's about, briefly.
Awesome. So yeah, myself and Andy Morgan and Andrea Valdez, the newest coach of 3DMJ, and Andy Morgan is a great fitness writer and works with people himself. We're collaborating on turning the muscle and strength nutritional pyramid and training pyramid, the pyramids I made on YouTube on our YouTube channel, into books. They get really in depth and give very, very practical advice and are useful to whether you're, a coach or an athlete who really wants to learn this stuff and digs in quite deep. We're going to be releasing them probably end of this month, potentially mid-November. They'll have their own website. It'll be like muscleandstrengthpyramids.com or something like that. But they're not quite released yet, but we're definitely going to make the announcement on 3dmusclejourney.com, on my Facebook, on our YouTube channel. So it will not be unnoticed, and I'll do my best to promote it and get it out there so someone won't go, what, he wrote a book? So, but yeah, that's coming. And then just always to check us out on our YouTube channel, Team 3DMJ, and Facebook is very vibrant for us as well. The other guys have Instagram accounts. I don't. And also, if you're interested in research, my ResearchGate.
Perfect. Cool. Thank you so much, Eric, for giving an interview with someone who has like 5 or 6 viewers at the moment, but hopefully this will go viral because people deserve to see this awesome episode. So thank you so much, and good luck with your PhD.
Thank you very much, and you did a great job. I'll always love good questions.
Cool. Thank you. All right. Take care then.
You too.
Okay. Now I just stopped the